Right now we're looking at the Gospels, and so if you will follow along in your harmony, and note the readings are on the section. So, for instance, in the Thomas harmony, section 1 is Luke's purpose for writing the Gospel. Section 2 is John's prologue. So start off with the prologues. Now, a harmony may decide to use John's prologue first and then Luke's. Most of the harmonies are the same in a lot of the groupings, but sometimes they'll group a little differently. And so that's why I've given different numberings of what to read in your syllabus. But we'll go by the Thomas harmony, because I like to teach the English classes from New American Standard, and so that's the one that uses it. But if you get a Bible software program, you can, I think, at least I know you can with Logos, I think with most of them, you can take a harmony and then put whatever translation you want, or even put the Greek in there, and it'll just immediately put the text and divide it up as the harmony does. So I think it's really highly useful. Right, so we'll start, then we're on Luke's prologue, so that's Luke 1 through 4. But before that, the titles. So the titles are not really part of the Gospels, and all the Gospels are anonymous because none of the Gospel writers put their name in the text as the writer. Now, their names are on the titles, but those were put later by the church. They weren't original with the text, right? So there are 9 anonymous writings in the New Testament, but we have a strong church tradition for each of them except Hebrews. We can argue about Hebrews in a good Christian debate, and that's fine. And I think since we don't know who wrote Hebrews, then we can certainly understand it without knowing who wrote it. But except for Hebrews, I think knowing who wrote it gives us a helpful insight into understanding the other 8 anonymous texts in the Scripture. As I think I mentioned earlier, the titles were put on there later. But what the titles show is very early tradition for each of the 4 Gospels. So early, we don't have any Greek Gospel beginning without a title. All right? So we don't have any Greek beginning with no title. So they're put on extremely early. And we have copies certainly into the 2nd century. We even have some fragments in the very early 2nd century, some fragments, and then there's a debate about possibly some from the 1st century. We'd have some fragments really early. Okay, so here's some examples. And I've just copied this from Codex Sinaiticus, Kata Mathion. And so you see how the letters, this is 2 words, but there's no space in between. And that's the way that the texts were written. All capital letters, all right, the uncial letters, no space in between. So that just means according to Matthew. So they all have this, they all either have a short or a long title. This is the short one. There's Matthew, then there's Kata Marka. Now there is a space there because it is a title, but there's not normally space between the text and often not between the title. All right, so that's one, that's the short title. And then there's Evangelion Kata Mathion, and so that's the gospel according to Matthew. All right, so I've copied it there again from, this is a Papyrus 4. Sometimes it's hard to read, and sometimes, by the way they wrote it, even when you learn Greek here, you're learning Greek from a nicely typed text with spaces in between the words, and thank the Lord that they do it that way for non-native readers. But when you then you're trying to read the manuscript, one, it's all caps, and you don't learn Greek that way, so that's a little disconcerting. And then no spaces between the letters, so it takes some acclimation to get used to that. And then sometimes they leave letters out, and they'll put a bar over, like they'll shorten God and Jesus and related terms like salvation and heaven. And that's called a nomen sacrum. They'll put a bar over it, just use the first and last letters. What that's showing is this is a really special name, a sacred name. And so you look at that and go, what's going on? Because you didn't learn that in Greek class either. But that's just showing the special name. And then, these texts were written to be read orally. So when the reader comes to it and reads Iota Sigma instead of Iesus, but it's got a bar over it, so he knows that's Jesus, and he just reads Jesus. And you don't know that it was a nomen sacrum, but when you look at the text, you do. So I'm just saying there's more than meets the eye, so to speak, when you look at the text. All right. So what does gospel mean? Well, gospel means good news, euangelion. And, of course, this can refer to the message, the salvation message. Salvation is available to anyone when they place their faith in Christ, but also can refer to the book. All right, so we have here's a twofold meaning of the gospel. And understand most words have multiple meanings, but the way you know a specific meaning when you read it is the context around it. All right, so since these four writings emphasize what Jesus came and shared and did, then they're called gospels. Now, how many gospels are there in the whole world in all of time? And we have four in the New Testament, but how many totally think that there are? Because there are a lot of apocryphal gospels. How many do you think that there are gospels that there really are? What? Okay, there are 23. Anyone else? It's a semi-trick question, I'll say. But how many? I mean, Dan Brown, in his theological writing, The Da Vinci Code, said that there are dozens and dozens and dozens. There's only four. Only four true gospels. Now, if I ask how many bogus gospels, 23 is not bad, but there's probably up into the 30s possibly, but of bogus gospels. And so I'd use a lowercase g for that. Then I'd go bogus, all right, to emphasize that. But what I'm saying, my point is, those fake ones are gospel wannabes, but they're not true gospels. So of the gospel genre, there's been only four in existence. Now, some could say, well, they're like an ancient bios and things like that. And I go, yeah, they're like that, but they're not. And so I have four gospels, and they have a few dozen wannabes, and then that's it. All right, so the genre, again, represented only by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's very selective in material. Now, typically, a biography or ancient Roman bios, it'll tell you a lot more about the birth in early years than the Gospels do. I mean, all Gospels, all we have a little information about the birth, one event when Jesus was 12, and then wham, he's about the age of 30. That's it. With other writings would typically give more childhood events to show our hero is the way he is because of this event back from his childhood. And so we have these bogus gospels of little bitty Jesus going around and doing these miracles. And like somebody makes them mad, he'll zap them dead. And I mean, that's ridiculous. But see, they're trying to fill in the blank, so to speak, and, talk about him as a baby or toddler. They'll tell you that they have him popping out of Mary preaching a sermon. I know that didn't happen, okay? This is ridiculous. He had to develop physically like we do. He was 100% human. Now, he was also 100% divine, but that did not override the human development, right? Jesus babbled as a baby and wasn't, expositing the scriptures when he's 2 months old. but the bogus gospels have him doing stuff like that. All right, then there are theological interpretations of history. These are not like reading what reading the newspaper is supposed to be. Now, back when I was your age, back in the days of yore, we'd read the newspaper, and the writer's opinion was only on the editorial page, right? Everything else was supposed to be objective reporting of the news. Now, you're not used to that, because today there's editorial opinion in almost every news article written or on television. And and so that's actually like what the Gospels are. They're not just saying what happened. They're saying what happened, and here is why. All right? This is an important event. Here's why. They're showing you the theological reason for that. And Acts is the same way. And I'm glad. I don't want it to be just an objective, here's what happens. I want it to be a subjection. Look, here's what happened and here's what God wants you to know about that. Or here's what happened and here's why. Right? And then, as I mentioned, it's extant, in other words, in existence only in the 4 Gospels. Right, so the prologue of Luke, now we're in section 1, and we see that Luke was probably, and so the T is the Thomas and Gundry, the C is Cox and Easley, the R is A.T. Robertson, and I think the Allende text follows fairly closely to the C and R, but that's what my little secret code means. And so you ought to be able to figure out where I'm asking you to read each class in the Gospels. Okay, so Luke 1:1, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, all right, many have written that. So obviously he's not talking about just Mark and Matthew, and John hadn't been written yet. So we see here, clearly there's a written source. See what I'm saying? Luke is talking about written accounts. Now, not full-blown Gospels, but some things that are written down. Just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses. And notice Luke is talking about them in the third person. So he's not saying he was an eyewitness. If he were, he'd say, we eyewitnesses, first person plural. He didn't say that. And servants of the word have handed them down to us, seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully. Now, with the eyewitness, I'd say that also would include the oral stage there. So Luke talked to these people. Hey, tell me what happened. You were there. Tell me about that. Seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully. Now, here, if God dictated the Gospel of Luke to Luke, Luke would not have needed to investigate anything or talk to anyone. He'd just sit in the corner and read and write dictation. But we see clearly that's not what happened. That God guided the process using Luke's personality, interests, studies, interviews, and then the end result is everything Luke wrote, every word is inerrant. In other words, every word of the original autograph. Well, the autograph. We say original autographs, we realize of the original. All right, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you might know the exact truth about the things that you have been taught. Okay, so Luke's not an eyewitness, and then he investigated this. So again, we see that God obviously used this investigative process as part of the process of the inspiration of this gospel. Now, writing in consecutive order, it can mean chronological, and most of the Gospels are in chronological order, but they're not always. So, consecutive doesn't mean necessarily chronological. It can also mean logical, theological, thematic, or more complete. And we see examples of each of those. Okay, so you're asking, okay, give me an example. Okay, glad you asked. So, Matthew and Luke mention in the temptation of Satan, of Jesus by Satan, what he tempted him with. Mark just says he was tempted, all right? He doesn't give the details. Matthew has, Satan said, turn the stones to bread, cast yourself off the temple, bow down to me. Luke has stones to bread first, but bow down to me second, cast yourself off the temple third. So either Matthew reversed the order or Luke did. Now, so what's going on? Well, then I'd say right off the bat, they're not writing in chronological order. One changed the order for a thematic order. Most likely, what's going on is Luke changed it in a thematic order. How do we know that? Well, remember I mentioned Luke, they used the ox or the cow to represent Luke. And Luke had an emphasis on the temple and sacrifice. He starts with sacrifice. There's Zacchaeus in the temple. His one time as a priest in his whole lifetime of doing this, ministering in the temple, and then Gabriel appears to him, etc. And then in this unit of the first 2 chapters, it ends with the temple, with Jesus being left behind by mistake by his parents in the temple. Luke has an emphasis on the temple and on sacrifice. So remember and I think Matthew has the chronological order. So Luke takes the second temptation, cast yourself off the temple, and he mentions it third because Luke has an emphasis on sacrifice and on the temple. He's bringing out that thematic element. So he's not saying Satan chronologically did this. He's saying here's three temptations, but he decides to mention the temple in third for a thematic reason. Or you could call that a theological emphasis as well, the emphasis on the temple. Or logical. We see there's some groupings of sayings of Jesus on a similar subject. Matthew likes to do that. And it doesn't mean he said one of these after another. Sometimes he grouped these pronouncement sayings or these parables Jesus gave thematically, like Matthew 13, and then they're all there together. But he's not saying chronologically Jesus did that, and that. Now, don't be discombobulated by that. By and large, they are chronological. But within that, we see sometimes there's some change. I mentioned intercalation in Mark. As a great storyteller, Mark would hold off some events till the A event, then the B, and then the A prime, so that you'd see there's this order where each of them helps you understand the other one, such as cursing the fig tree, temple cleansing, back to the fig tree. Why in the world did Jesus curse the fig tree? Well, the temple cleansing helps us understand that, and we'll get to that later. But, you see, Mark purposely, it's like when you have children and you say their names and it takes you a minute to get to the right one. Mark gives us that in that way so that we'll see those stories are connected. All right? So understand when Luke says consecutive, doesn't have to mean chronological. And then that helps us. Or one more example, because I know you want one more. Sometimes there's foreshadowing or sometimes there's flashback. So John mentions the anointing of Jesus on Saturday night before the Passion. Matthew and Mark mention it among Tuesday events of the Passion Week, the week Jesus was crucified and resurrected. Well, when did it happen, Saturday or Tuesday? Well, we see that Matthew and Mark use it as a flashback because they're showing when Judas sealed the deal to Judas Iscariot to betray Jesus. And they're going, oh yeah, and by the way, when Jesus was anointed, flashback, that's what pushed Judas Iscariot over the edge. He was just really irate about this, what he considered a waste of money for anointing Jesus. All right, so there are those elements as well. Okay, so who's Theophilus? Well, Theos is God, phileo, love. This is lover of God. Was he a patron of Luke? In other words, he paid money for Luke then to be able to compile the Gospel of Luke as well as Acts, because Acts is dedicated to him as well. Was that his birth name? Was that the name given to him? It could have been. Or was it he's a believer and that was his baptism name? The early church would sometimes do that. They'd baptize you in following your salvation experience, and then they'd give you a Christian name because now your life has been changed since you made that commitment to Christ. Or this is not really referring to an individual, but to every Christian who should be a lover of God. There is that possibility. He's saying, look, if you're a reader, you ought to be a lover of God. Now, I don't believe it's the latter. I think we have to say it could be. We just don't know anything about Theophilus. Some think, well, maybe he was part of the Roman government system, since he said most excellent, because that's how you'd address a government official. But I don't think we can even read that into it. I think Luke's just being very respectful to this person and giving him this account of Jesus, and then in Acts giving him account of the early church. So one day we'll find out who Theophilus was when we get to heaven, but we don't know now. So it's just an interesting question, but we just don't know the answer. All right, but this prologue is very similar to Acts, and that's one reason we know that Luke wrote both, because Acts is also anonymous, but it has a very similar introduction, a dedication to Theophilus. So you go, well, they're both written by the same person. In Acts, part of the second and third missionary journey, the author says we, So he was with Paul. So who are the guys with Paul? And by a process of elimination, it comes down to Luke. So even apart from church history, you can put together the details and examine it and see, hey, it's Luke that wrote both. All right, then John's prologue. Now, you could start with John's prologue. They're both prologues, and John's goes back to the very beginning of time. But since Luke refers to how he got his information, and it's shorter, a lot of people mention that one first in a harmony. Okay, so John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All right, so the beginning of what? In the beginning of what is he saying? Yeah, I mean, of everything. Yeah, the beginning of time. God made time. Everything that's created, God made it. So in that very beginning, Jesus has existed. All right? How do we know the Word is Jesus? Context. So in the context shows us that he's the Word. That's why we capitalize it. Because remember, in the first several centuries, it was all caps. So we have to come back and decide, okay, what do we believe should be capitalized? And so we capitalize personal nouns. In other words, a noun that would refer to someone specific, right? So Word was with God and the Word was God. So we see, in verse 2, he was in the beginning with God, right? So we see these great truths, divine preexistence, all right? So when Christ came to this earth and was born of the Virgin Mary, that wasn't when he started, all right? He was back in the beginning with the Father. So we see his preexistence and we see his divinity, all right? He's God. The New World Translation, which is a heretical translation by Jehovah's Witnesses, say the Word was a God because it does not have the article with it. But since it's in apposition and Word should go first, then it has the article. I believe that's easily understood that this is the correct interpretation, also based on the context. But what they'll say is a God, lowercase g. And that's not what the text is saying. He was not only with God, verse 2, but he was God. Obviously, he still is God, but the point is he is divine. All right? But then we see the second person, separate personhood, because he was with God. Now, where's the Holy Spirit? Well, he's around, but the emphasis is on the Father and Son, okay? But there's always been the Trinity. God's one God, but three persons in one, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. John's emphasis here is on Christ, of course, and showing he's been there in the beginning, and he is God, but he's a separate person from God, and is integrally involved in the process. Verse 3, all things came into being by him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and life was light of men. All right, so these beautiful descriptions of Christ being the light of the world. And of course, he talked about that later. He said, I am the light of the world. All right, so the light shines in the darkness, and John liked to use these dichotomous themes. Then I really like this says verse 9, and I think I keep forgetting to make that change. It should say verse 6. Is a great description of John. There came a man sent from God whose name was John, and that's John the Baptist. And I think it's a great verse. We should all hope that said about us. Either there came a man sent from God, or there came a woman sent from God, and then in your name. I mean, I hope that when I see him one day, Jesus will say, well done, my good and faithful servant. That I've been doing what he called me to do, and I do believe I'm where he wants me to be, and I hope you are as well, right? So I believe God has special things for each one of us individually to do, and we see here that John did that. Obviously, the emphasis is on Jesus, but John was the forerunner, and he did what God set out for him to do. So he's not the one. Verse 7, he came to bear witness of the one. So verse 8, he's not the light, all right? But he's bearing witness of that. Verse 9, there was the true light which coming into the world enlightens every man. Well, does that mean then everyone is saved? Does verse 9 teach universalism? And if not, why not? Or if so, why so? I mean, verse 9 really sounds like it's teaching universalism. So, what say you?
I mean, John might be saying that light goes to all men without distinction rather than exception. So, like, all men, no matter where they live, no matter, what race they are.
I like that, but I'm going to be devil's advocate and say, yeah, but I think it means he saves every man. So how can you tell me that you give me a good option, but how can you tell me it's not that? Yeah.
Of the New Testament, it doesn't fit the gospel.
Right. It doesn't fit the context of all the gospels, but then specifically you can get even more. You can get closer than that. Look at verse 12. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name. So it shows us that, no, not everybody's saved. And like you were saying, in enlightening, yeah, that's what that's saying is that, not that everybody's saved. So I think we need to look at the context, because I'm telling you, there are a lot of people out there that believe in universalism. And you say, as I believe correctly, Jesus is the only way of salvation. A lot of people say, no, that's not right, and the Bible doesn't even teach that. No, the Bible does teach that, but you need to know where. And then verses that sound like universalism then help show them how, no, that's not really what it's saying. You go to the context and you see you cannot give that a universalistic interpretation. All right, so verse 14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. You probably heard some say through the years, well, tabernacled is one way. Oh, forgot verse 11. Got to go back to that. I went forward to verse 12. He came to his own did not receive him. Well, that's, of course, the Jews. Unfortunately, many Jews did not receive Christ. They're expecting a different type of Messiah, and we'll get into that later. But Christ dwelled among us, and we can be so thankful for that. That's how much God loves us. He came and became one of us, though, of course, Christ was fully divine. He didn't stop being divine when he came here to this earth. The only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, only begotten, this monogenes, that's not saying he was the first one born. It sounds like that, but in this context, what it means is preeminence. Okay, so we'll see that from time to time. Christ is the only begotten of God. What that's showing is he is preeminent over all of God's creation. Not that he's the first one created, because he never was created. He has always existed. So we've got to understand that in context. Okay, so then we come to section 3, which has the beginning of Matthew. So we've gotten through the 2 prologues, John's prologue much longer. Now, the start of Matthew, but then we have to get to Luke 3 to get the genealogy. And so we put the genealogies back to back. And so here's the area, Palestine, up in Galilee, then where Mary and Joseph were. And then there's a tradition that says Mary was born in Sepphoris, which the title the name is called Zipporee today. Whether she's from there, I don't know. I mean, there's no way to know. It doesn't really matter. But this is a town just a few miles from Nazareth, where Jesus then grew up. And so it's interesting to see the excavations there. Those are some bulks of the ongoing excavation. And then I mentioned about the theater. That holds, from the time it was built, about 10 times as many people that could sit there, so that helps us with understanding population. And then there's all these mosaics at Sepphoris, such as the Mona Lisa that showed you last week. I mean, what they call it. It's not the Mona Lisa, but they call it the Mona Lisa of Sepphoris. But there's so many mosaics that in Sepphoris, they figured just about everybody had mosaics. interesting one to me is here are this is in a synagogue, and the Jews were, by tradition, did not have any picture of man nor animal. And yet, obviously, these were backslidden Jews that had pictures like this. And so, now this is an Amazon woman, which I think is a great illustration, though that you can't use it in church exactly. But Amazon, alpha privative means a negative or un in Greek. So that means no breast. But what does that mean? This is a legend. The Amazon woman would cut off her right breast so that she could pull back on the bow and be a better shot. Now, I'm just saying that's the legend. And so they depict him either with no breasts, either one, or with no right breast. And I've made this sanitized for your protection in the picture. But to me, this is a great illustration of commitment. I mean, if you're that committed to being a good shot, it's weird, all right, but it's committed. All right, so anyway, there's interesting mosaics there. And again, in the synagogue, they typically have these geometric shapes like that. I mean, what we call it today, geometric shape, but they also have these pictures of, this is actually a zodiac. So that's something interesting too, because zodiac has typically had occultish connotations. What in the world is a zodiac doing in a synagogue? And that's not unusual for ancient synagogues. And you can write a paper on that sometime later in your journey, and then let us know why. All right, here's the water system, because Sepphoris was way up high, one of these cities set on a hill, as Jesus talked about, and so they had this water system to bring water up there. All right, so the genealogy. What are some things we notice about the genealogy? Well, first of all, most people don't look at genealogies, right? They read through the Bible and they start seeing a bunch of names and they skip to the end because they go, what can I learn from that? And the way they think about genealogies is, you see that movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off? When the teacher's calling his name, he's not there, he goes, Bueller, Bueller. And so I picture people reading genealogies like this. To Abraham was born Isaac, and to Isaac, Jacob, and then so they're falling asleep by the time that they finish. So what we need people to understand is there's really a lot of exciting history that's mentioned here as you look and see how these things are set up. So what I did was I put then Matthew's genealogy that's a lot of names, so it fits on 2 slides. Then to bring out the interesting aspects of Jesus' genealogy, that I put some overlays in there. As you look at the history of the names that are mentioned, now there's a lot more names. Matthew and Luke, neither one mention all the names, but they hit the highlights. Look at the problems of God's people coming down from Abraham, where Matthew starts, down to Jesus. So the hostile neighbors, the threat of the Egyptians, the Philistines, the Assyrians. Of course, what we're learning is the people turned away from God, and God allowed these neighbors to conquer them. And so as we read these names, these are the time periods of what's going on. Then the Babylonian threat, then the intertestamental time, and now the Roman occupation, which the people experiencing when Jesus was born. Or let's examine it another way. Look at the people God used. Just some regular Joes. I mean, who was Abram? He's just a regular Joe. He was good looking or rich or had a great personality. He's just a regular Joe God chose to be the head of the whole Jewish nation. And we'll look at Isaac. We don't even know much about Isaac. I mean, we know he was the child of promise, and all that's very special, but tell me something about Isaac. We don't know much about Isaac, just kind of a regular guy. All right, then David, a shepherd, and then kings. All right, so the different kinds of people that God used in the genealogies. Then how about the types of people? Well, liars, adulterers, polygamists, wicked kings. And so, again, God can use us even despite our shortcomings. As some say, God uses, bent sticks or whatever. Not straight sticks, but bent ones. Uses us warts and all. And then the controversial women, all right? Canaanite acting like a prostitute, a Canaanite prostitute, a Hittite, Moabite. So we're learning a lot as you then not just read a name, but try to figure out, hey, what do we know about that person from the Old Testament? And then what's God telling us through this genealogy? And so just a plea to you as you teach and preach the Bible, don't ignore these sections, because most people tend to. Help your people to understand. Look, when Jews read Matthew, because it was written first to Jews, when they read these names, they knew what was going on. They knew these were different types of people. These were men and women that God used that were sinners, and God used them in spite of that. They even using non-Jews in Jesus' genealogy, as Matthew points out, they knew that. But a 21st century reader reading this, unfortunately, typically doesn't know any of that, because they don't know their Old Testament at all or very well. So just help bring this out. Okay, so then what are some things we notice as we put these genealogies side by side? Just say them out loud. What are some things we notice of the genealogies that you say out loud to me right now? Are they the same, Matthew and Luke's? But I said that to you. You said something to me. What are the differences? Okay, reverse order. All right, so you know what? Your harmony can either decide to keep them in reverse order, or it might reverse the order of one so that you can compare them in the same order, just for comparative purposes. Okay, what else? We'll get to that. But yeah, what else? Just looking at the names. Okay, Matthew goes to Abraham. Luke goes all the way back to Adam. Where are they? Where are they located? So Matthew starts. Luke waits till chapter 3. What's going on there? Right, and then the different names, as you mentioned about Mary and Joseph, but we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so you look at the text, and before you read commentaries and all that stuff, you examine the text, all right? And you try to learn as much as you can just from the text, and then you go to the Old Testament or other Gospels and read about the names, try to learn about the name. Okay, so then we see, as we put them up side by side, well, Matthew doesn't go all the way back to Adam, but they both go back to Abraham. And so the names are the same up to David, but then they diverge. So they are, for some reason, different genealogies. All right, so you've got to then decide, what do you think is going on? Okay, and then by the way, so why Luke waiting till chapter 3 and why Adam? Well, remember, I've mentioned, well, Matthew was written to Jews and Luke written to Gentiles. Why do we say that? Well, the textbook said that. Why does the textbook say that? Why does the professor say that? He's a knucklehead anyway. Well, because of stuff like this. See, Matthew's writing to Jews. And he's want to convince them that Jesus is the Messiah. Well, they don't care anything about him till he says he's of the right lineage. See what I'm saying? Hey, so-and-so is the Messiah. A Jew would say, oh, really? Prove it. Tell me the lineage. Is he of the tribe of Judah and the house of David? If he's not, why would I bother listening to anything else you said? And then Luke's writing, and so he goes to Abraham, because who cares about before that? Abraham's the first Jew. All right, and so Luke's, we see from what he did, going all the way back to Adam, showing we all have a connection, and then waiting until chapter 3, because the Gentile doesn't care. Jesus is the Messiah. Oh, really? What's a Messiah? Oh, well, we'll get to that later. Okay, so let me tell you about the birth of John the Baptist and all that stuff. And then now, hey, here's the Messiah. There's the lineage in chapter 3, and I'll show you why that's important. So we see by how they put it, what they put, who their audience is, and what God was wanting them to bring out. Okay, so Matthew's genealogy. The genealogies are only in Matthew and Luke, all right? Of course, not in Mark, not in John, nor the apocryphal sayings of Gospel of Thomas. Now, I'm not going to mention that each time. Unfortunately, there are harmonies that have not only the four Gospels, but Thomas's Gospel, which is just stupid. I mean, there's just really not another name for that except stupid. To call the Sayings Gospel of Thomas a gospel is ludicrous because it has virtually no narrative. It's 114 sayings of Jesus. And a lot of them are in the Gospels anyway. So why would you call that writing with no narrative to speak of, just a little, 114 sayings, why would you call that a gospel? It is so, it's light years different from the four Gospels. But here's the thing. If a person doesn't believe in God, then they like Mark because it's the shortest, has the fewest miracles, has nothing about the virgin birth, the least about the resurrection. So that's, I think, the appeal of Mark to the liberal theologian. But now since the World War II, they've rediscovered the Gospel of Thomas. They really love the Gospel of Thomas. So now Luke's been replaced as the wonder child by liberal theologians with the Gospel of Thomas because, I said Luke, Mark's been replaced by the Gospel of Thomas. Because Mark does have miracles. Gospel of Thomas has no miracles. So no virgin birth, no bodily resurrection, none of that. So what the liberal theologians say is, well, that's obviously the first gospel. And then these other guys made up these miracles that didn't happen. So you need to understand the impetus behind, I think, what's pushing their agenda. But why is the genealogy not in Mark and Luke? And I think the answer there is just the sovereignty of God. I don't think we have to come up with or can a reason why each gospel says or doesn't say something, but just that God led Mark and John to focus on different things, right? So, already mentioned they put the genealogy in different places. So Matthew starts with it because it's important to the Jews, and Luke waits because non-Jews didn't really care, didn't really know about that. Then different starting points mention that, Matthew to Abraham and Luke to Adam, so everybody can identify because we do all go back to Adam. By the way, I like the young earth theory, and I like the proofs for it. But you know what? I can live with somebody being an old earth proponent as long as we agree Adam was the first man. To me, that's the theological area where there's no way we can give in on that one. So, I prefer young earth, but if somebody's the old earth, that's fine as long as they believe there was a real Adam and a real Eve, that Adam sinned and we all sin in Adam. Because if they believe it was just a group of people, then the New Testament's wrong because it says in Adam we all sin. There's the first Adam, and then Jesus was the second Adam, so you lose all that. Question?
So
yeah.
John the Baptist, he's from the tribe of Levi, Jesus from David.
There was intermarriage, and you went by the tribe of the dad. So just tradition, So, and in fact, you even went just by the dad to be a Jew. So how are you a Jew? If your dad's a Jew, you're a Jew. Now, typically Jews marry Jews because that's what they were supposed to do, but they didn't have to. And we see that there's some non-Jews in Jesus' genealogy, non-Jew by race, but then became Jewish by religion. But you went by the dad. Now, in the Middle Ages, the Jews changed. Now you're a Jew if you have a Jewish mom. They changed in the Middle Ages. They haven't changed back. But that's why. And so every girl prayed she would bear the Messiah, whether she's from the tribe of Judah or not, because any girl could marry a man from the tribe of Judah, and then that would be considered fine. In other words, then the Messiah being from the tribe of Judah. However, having said that, I do believe both Mary and Joseph were from the tribe of Judah. But you could marry outside the tribe. Just you weren't supposed to marry a non-Jew. All right, so I think we have to agree there's an Adam. Yes, question?
One quick question about the genealogy. So when I was looking at Luke here,
Mm-hmm.
it says when he began his ministry, Jesus himself was about 30 years of age.
Mm-hmm.
Being as was the son of Joseph, the son of Eli. What does that, I mean?
Yeah, the supposedly? Yeah. Yeah, I know. That's a great question. That's where you have to go to back to the Greek and then understand the way they wrote. Because in English, it sounds really bad. well, supposedly the son of Joseph, we're not sure. And that's not what he's saying. What he's saying is more, this is how it goes, or as the story goes. So it's a great question, because I usually bring that out at some point, because it's not, it sounds willy-nilly and we don't know, and Luke doesn't mean it that way at all. But that's where you go, look, the English, since it's a second language and, it was written in Greek, then that can be misleading until we go back and then see how it was used. All right, and we mentioned in opposite order. I'd just like for you to give that back to me before I give it to you. Matthew writes these in 3 groups of 14. Why? Well, in every ancient language, they had a number attached to each letter. Usually the first letter was 1, second letter 2, etc. Babylonians were an exception. They counted by 6s. But that's because they didn't use numbers like we use today. When they wrote a number, they wrote it in the letters. And you'd see by the context it was a number. So every Jew knew David equaled 14. They knew as you added up those letters, it equaled 14. So what does Matthew do? He writes the genealogy, because he's leaving names out. They both leave names out. There's more names than that going back to Adam or going back to Abraham. But 3 groups of 14. So what is he doing? He's shouting, David, David, David. And that's a key, because you have to be a descendant of David. All right? So, in other words, not only in the tribe of Judah, but from the house of Jesse. So he's basically screaming David. Now, technically, 2 groups are 13 and one's 14, but Semitically counting, it works. And David's mentioned, his name's repeated, so it is 3 groups of 14. By the way, a DVD disc that I think people still use sometimes, a DVD has 14 tracks? Not really, just kidding. But the Hebrew consonants for David do equal 14. And so it's called, did I get some of you on that one? That's gematria, and so there is some gematria in the Bible. All right, so then Luke goes all the way back to Adam. And it's time to end. Goes by so quickly. But have a great day, and remember then, we won't come back till Thursday, but I'll put that on on Blackboard. Questions? Okay, I'll answer a question, but feel free to go. Yes.
Going back to the temptations.
Yeah.
You showed that how Luke probably reversed the order.
Yeah.
2 and 3. He was wanting to know what order do you think Matthew.
Okay, so back to the temptations. I believe Matthew gave the chronological order. It makes sense to me, and to most of us, the biggest temptation would be bow down to Satan. That'd be the worst. Worse than turning stones to bread or jumping off the temple. So since bowing down to Satan is most obviously the worst, I think that's the 3rd one, and Matthew's the correct in the order. And that's where most theologians come down to. Matthew giving the chronological order, starting with the simple, stones of bread, and then the worst one bowing down. But there are some that think Luke gave the right order and Matthew reversed them. But most of us believe Matthew gave the right chronological order.
In the Greek, he uses to say this happened and then this happened, whereas Luke just says this happened, that happened.
Yeah, but that's not totally definitive. So sometimes they'll say and then, and they're not saying necessarily chronological. But I am saying I think that's a secondary reason we could use. But it's not definitive, because some don't go by that. Anything else? Okay. Let me stop the deal real quick.